We're kind of swiftly approaching a kind of massive pivot in gaming technology.
Today we're announcing our next generation.
Yesterday at CES in Las Vegas, Nevada, NVIDIA finally unveiled the worst-kept secret in PC gaming, the 50 series GPUs. And we are joined by Digital Foundry's Richard Leadbetter, one of the few people on Earth who has gone hands-on with the 5080 graphics card from NVIDIA to talk about the exciting future that is in front of us now. Richard, thank you so much for joining me.
That's my pleasure.
Now, first off, what makes the 50 series cards so important?
That's an interesting question because we're kind of swiftly approaching a kind of massive pivot in gaming technology where, essentially to get more performance from graphics hardware, typically the route forward by the likes of AMD, NVIDIA, Intel, has basically been to increase the amount of transistors of logic that's on a particular chip. And they do that by having, basically by shrinking the chips in order to fit more transistors in, right? And so every time there's a major sort of technological leap that enables this shrinkage of transistors, it means that you can get more logic onto a chip, which means that there's more performance, right? But here's the thing, the cost of actually shrinking transistors is actually rising drastically. So the ability to actually make more complex logic is reducing drastically. This is a reason why PlayStation 5 Pro, for example, is $700. It's because the actual ability to make these chips is getting harder and harder and more expensive and more expensive. So we are actually seeing a reduction of transistor size of 50 series. However, the emphasis from NVIDIA has basically been on AI. So they're basically investing more of that logic into AI. And therefore, the AI is producing more of the performance leap this time around. Well, I had actually called it a frame rate leap. When we move into sort of talking about performance, that's a really complex topic. But basically, frame generation, that's what's kind of interesting about 50 series. Basically, with the 40 series, they introduced frame generation, and it was adding in one generated frame, kind of sandwiched between two traditionally rendered frames. What's happening now is that there's actually up to 3 additional frames between two standard rendered frames. And it gives the illusion of, of smoother frame rates, right? There are physically more frames being generated by the GPU. It's just they're being generated in a different way. They aren't being sort of rendered from the ground up by the GPU. The GPU is producing 2 frames, sort of a beginning and an end point, and then between those 2 frames are the generated frames. And it's all being done with AI. On the 40 series cards, they actually used what they called an optical flow accelerator, which was generally used for the automotive industry, but that was basically how they were calculating what that intermediate frame would look like. For 50 series, it's fully AI, and the AI is generating more frames, and it's generating them seemingly more quickly, which is how you're able to get these massive performance multipliers, frame rate multipliers, I should say. That's an interesting topic in of itself, the whole concept of performance, because one of the key claims that NVIDIA made at CES was that the 5070 has the same performance as a 4090, but it only has what I would describe as the same frame rate as a 4090, and it's doing it via these new generated frames that it's adding with DLSS 4. And this whole concept of what performance is these days is going to be quite a controversial topic, because from my perspective, performance is not just frame rate. Typically, the higher the frame rate, the lower the input lag. And that's how things have been for, however long, many, many years. But now what's happening is latency is added by frame generation. So the increase in frame rate is pretty clear to see, but the actual feel of it in the controls is going to be much the same as without frame generation. So it's really interesting how this is all sort of playing out and how we're using the term performance going forward. Because when NVIDIA is claiming 5070 performance being on par with 4090, not really, but from one perspective, kind of. So that's sort of like the key thing going forward, because they can't actually reduce the size of processors and cram on more logic. The frame rate boosts are actually going to be coming from software via AI rather than hardware. So that's sort of the way things are going looking forward. It's exactly what was happening on PS5 Pro, because the GPU was bigger there, but it wasn't dramatically bigger as it would have been in the past. And what they're doing there is using AI to make up the difference in exactly the same way. The other thing from 50 series, which is really interesting, is that obviously DLSS upscaling, super resolution, has been like a key feature for NVIDIA pretty much from 2020 onwards, when it got seriously good. The other enhancement they've made is to move to a much more sophisticated upscaling model. And we actually showed this in our video where we were sort of comparing the old DLSS to the new DLSS. And throughout the months and the years, we've been kind of highlighting that DLSS is the best upscaler, right? But it's not necessarily perfect. There are problems with image quality in certain scenarios. And we were able to test some of those scenarios and see that the actual quality boost there is significantly improved. So that's interesting as well. It's there's an emphasis on AI here over the actual specs of the card, but the specs of the cards look pretty decent. Yeah. So it's kind of like potentially a win-win on all fronts. But obviously we won't know for sure until we actually are able to test whatever we want to test in our own review process. Right. So yeah, lots going on, lots to be excited about.
Oh yeah. And you, to be clear, weren't using a production card. This was like an early, pre-release card, or could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, it was an engineering sample, which basically means it's kind of like one step from final. When I actually saw the card, it was it was exactly the same physically as a retail model. Just had a little sticker, a green sticker on the bottom that said engineering sample. So, in our video, we didn't actually show exact frame rate numbers because, well, those numbers are likely to change. The drivers also weren't anywhere near final, as I understand it. The build of Cyberpunk wasn't complete. So, it was good for showing like rough ballpark increases from the likes of multi-frame generation. And obviously the software side of things with DLSS 4 was in a pretty good shape, so we could show the improvements to super resolution quality. I'd say it's as close to final as you're going to get, basically.
Got it. And you talked about, of course, the upscaling, the possibility to introduce latency for the sort of average PC gamer who maybe knows just enough that this is a new thing. How is it going to affect them? What is this going to mean to like John Q gamer?
Yeah, interesting question. Basically, what it means, the whole sort of idea here is basically that the shift, the ability to run stuff like Cyberpunk on, full path tracing mode, which is like pretty much one of the most demanding workloads in gaming. Basically, to be able to run that at higher and higher frame rates becomes possible with multi-frame generation. This is why they're able to make the claim that the 5070, which is like $549, that's pretty good value, right? Yeah. They're suggesting that the quote-unquote performance, I would say frame rate, will be on par with the outgoing RTX 4090, which was like $1,600 MSRP product, which was, I think the last time I was looking at stock available, it was well over $2,000. So yeah, this is, obviously whenever a new generation of graphics cards comes along, we're expecting to see strong performance boosts. The opportunity to do that is much more limited. Therefore, the investment in AI is really what NVIDIA is looking to get the payoff on. That's kind of the way it works, really.
Well, the possibility of latency, is that going to affect faster, like first-person shooter gamers should be concerned about, or is it not really going to be anything anyone can notice?
It's going to be something that this is a really tricky question to answer as well. Basically, the higher latency goes in any scenario, it's not great for a fast action game, right? So typically, frame generation isn't particularly recommended for that kind of experience. The thing is, though, in a game like Cyberpunk 2077, it's not really based on the idea of like super fast response. So it's a pretty good fit for that. It's a pretty good fit for a game like Black Myth Wukong. It's a pretty good fit for pretty much any AAA experience. But when you're talking about like fast-paced shooters where every millisecond counts, possibly it's not a great fit, to be honest. But having said that, the concept of latency is incredibly elastic. So let's put it this way. We did some latency testing on console games like a few years back. And we found out that like Doom 2016 and Call of Duty both run at 60 frames per second, right, on a PS4. However, Call of Duty's like operating at like a 30 millisecond latency. Doom is running at something like an 80 millisecond latency. So there's this huge gap in lag. But nobody has ever really complained about Doom 2016 saying, wow, the lag on this really isn't great. On the flip side, people do play Call of Duty and they do appreciate that sort of crisp response. So there's kind of like a personal perception of latency. It's kind of weird. Another classic example is basically like GTA and Red Dead Redemption. The animation in those games is incredibly laggy, like hundreds of milliseconds in some cases. And yet people sort of get on with those games and they aren't unplayable as such. It's just they feel heavier. Yeah, that's the thing. There's, for fast action games, adding latency, especially in esports, it's basically a no-go, right? AAA fare, Cyberpunk, that sort of thing, Alan Wake, less of an issue. It's even less of an issue if you're playing on a controller, for example. The controller's really weird. The amount of response you can get from a controller versus mouse and keyboard, it's kind of like massively deadened, if you like. So it's far less noticeable there. It's weird, but generally speaking, frame generation hasn't solved the latency problem. The thing that I found quite interesting, though, is that obviously when 40 series came along and they introduced frame generation, we saw that there was additional latency by buffering that extra frame and then calculating the one in the middle. This time they're calculating more frames, but the actual additional latency of those extra frames is very, very low. So if you're used to frame generation on a 40 series card, or if you've tried FSR3 on a console, for example, and you're okay with it, then you're probably going to be okay with it on 50 series with multi-frame generation. I mean, it's something that we're going to have to put a lot of testing into, because it turns out that, well, input latency can actually vary according to the graphics card you're using, which is why technologies like Radeon Anti-Lag and NVIDIA Reflex exist in the first place. They're trying to strip out, the latency in the pipeline and just speed it up as much as they can. It's all kind of definitely worthy of further investigation once we get hands-on with hardware. I mean, this is the other caveat that you've got to attach to this, is that these technologies tend to produce different results in different games. And obviously, I've only played Cyberpunk 2077, so it's sort of a very limited frame of reference there.
Right. So basically, the bottom line is, if you're playing those sort of fast twitch esports shooters, turn this feature off. It's not
possibly, yeah. I mean, or turn it on, and because it's a trade, right? I mean, you might enjoy the much faster frame rate versus the much faster response. But sure, there is a trade, right? Yeah, whereas before frame generation came along, there was no trade. If you had an increase in frame rate, you had a decrease in input lag. You had an increase in response, and that's kind of the thing that NVIDIA hasn't quite conquered. And to be fair, Intel has just released its own frame generation system based on the same principle. AMD's FSR3 frame generation, again, it's the same principle of buffering that frame and then calculating the one in the middle. And those have latency issues as well. So it's kind of like an industry-wide problem that hasn't yet been conquered. All I can really say based on the Cyberpunk testing is that the latency is much the same depending on, even if it's like generating 1 frame or 3. It's like in Cyberpunk, there was like a 5 to 6 millisecond, actually 5 to 7 millisecond difference between 1 generated frame and 3. But in the meantime, the difference in frame rate between 1 generated frame and 3, it's like an extra like 70% of frame rate, which looks really good. So it's about sort of picking your battles, really.
Right. Who should be considering an upgrade? Is this, if you're still rocking a 20 series or a 30 series or even a 40 series, like who should be considering an upgrade pretty seriously?
Yeah, my philosophy on this is pretty straightforward, is that if the games you're playing aren't performing in a way that you like anymore, if you've hit a bottleneck, if you should be considering an upgrade. But you think about the esports games, they run really, really, really fast. Do you need to upgrade? Are you unsatisfied with that experience? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. That's basically the criteria for if you're going to want to upgrade or not. But when you're dealing with the new advances that are coming along, like, for example, path tracing, what NVIDIA describes as full RT, this is like incredibly computationally expensive, and you kind of do need to factor in an upgrade on that. And that's why I suspect NVIDIA had that slide up saying 5070 had 4090 performance. They're basically trying to suggest, although there's a lot of asterisks and caveats attached to that an experience that was once exclusive to like a $1,600, $2,000 graphics card is now available for one that's like $570. That is a very contentious claim that needs to be proven out in reviews, I think. But you can see what they're trying to say. They're saying that these high-end features are now available at playable and fast frame rates, even on a 70 class product.
Very cool. Are there any other sort of bottlenecks that maybe people who are going to be looking to upgrade will need to be concerned with? Like, immediately that springs to mind is like maybe their motherboard won't be able to handle it, or obviously people are probably going to have to crank up their power supplies. But is there anything else that people might need to be considering if they're looking to upgrade?
Yeah, CPU. CPU is actually proven to be one of the surprises of this generation, where everybody thought moving from like PS4 to PS5, the CPU is so much better. It's like, okay, the CPU problem has been solved. But it actually turns out that there's a big bunch of CPU-heavy games out there, even on PC, even with like more performant parts than PS5 CPU. So CPU is actually proving to be really, really important at this point. AMD has a really nice upgrade option for people on their classic AM4 platform. It's like the 5700X3D or the 5800X3D. They can be dramatically faster. Those are really good chips. So, you don't necessarily have to throw away your old platform completely when there's chips like that. That said, the latest generation, the 9800X3D, super, super impressive, super, super fast. And there's always the danger that the advances in graphics technology are actually happening much faster than the advances in CPU technology. And this is actually something where frame generation can be helpful. I mean, there's games, the classic example being like Flight Simulator 2020, probably 2024. I haven't had time to look at that one yet. Star Wars Jedi Survivor, Stalker 2 is a very recent example there, where it kind of doesn't really matter how fast your GPU is. There are certain areas of the game that are going to be CPU limited, and therefore your GPU's just sort of sat there idle waiting for the CPU to complete its tasks. Frame generation is interesting there because you actually get the biggest multiples in frame rate increases when you're CPU limited, because the GPU is sitting there idle and it's saying, actually now it's like, oh, okay, I can be generating a frame. So you actually get like almost like 2x scaling from frame generation just from one generated frame. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that's going to play out with multi-frame generation, whether there's going to be like big increases in frame rate there. Power supplies. That's interesting because I think it's basically only really the 5090 that's potentially problematic there. Possibly the 5080, but all the cards beneath it seem to be quite reasonable in terms of power consumption. That's the thing, right? When you've got these new technologies, new chip fabrication technology, what's happening there is that you're generally getting the same increased transistor density, so you can have more performance if you like. But the powers budgets on those cheaper cards are generally only rising very, very incrementally. Whereas with the 5090, I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but it's the maximum power consumption there is looking very, very big indeed.
What about, I know you mentioned in your write-up about the sort of the new 240 hertz 4K monitors that are sort of hitting the market now. And I was going to ask, is this technology kind of a flip side? I remember when the 20 series came out is when the first 4K monitors came out, and they couldn't quite hit that 4K monitor. But is this sort of a flip of that? Is 240 going to be like no problem for these at 4K?
I wouldn't say that. I'd say 240 is probably like, you're talking about 5080, 5090 territory for that. That is stupendously fast. You don't actually need, if you've got a 240 monitor, it's more likely the case that you're kind of like operating in a frame rate window that's sort of 150 frames per second plus. It's actually really quite difficult to sort of tell the difference between like 150, 160 and 240 unless you're really sort of dialed in. What G-Sync is doing or FreeSync is basically allowing you to move within that window and for it to still look smooth. I actually had like a 4K 240 monitor in a couple of years ago before I bought one. I borrowed one from Samsung, and I carried out an experiment to see the threshold at which I could tell the difference. And it was kind of like, I couldn't really tell the difference in a lot of content between like 160 to 240. It's just preposterously smooth. So yeah, but when you're sort of running flat out at 240 and it's always at 240 and then you lurch down, that is kind of noticeable. But anything, well, from my perspective in sort of AAA gaming, anything above 120 just looks great. And multi-frame generation is going to allow more people to get into that window, even if the feel of the game isn't really any different to how it is running without frame generation, or possibly, slightly less responsive.
So basically, if you have your eye and the budget for that 4K OLED 240 hertz monitor, this is a great use case.
I'll tell you what, though. I mean, for many, many years now, I bought it in 2020. I've been using an LG 48-inch 120 hertz OLED. And I still use that screen to this day, but I have got the 240 and it is significantly better. But 120 is still really, really good, I have to say.
Right, very cool. One of the things that's all over the internet today is that a vendor at CES just had a Switch 2 prototype, and now we all basically know what that looks like. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what the possibilities of seeing DLSS tech in the Switch 2 is and what that could mean for Nintendo's next console.
Yeah. Oh, it's 100% in there. 99.9%. I mean, the hardware is capable of it. This is what's really interesting about Switch 2 is that although it's based on like GPU architecture from RTX like 30 series, the Ampere architecture, obviously those cards are still fully capable of running DLSS. They have been since day one. So yes, Switch 2 almost certainly 99.9% certainty that it will be using DLSS. The question is really what flavor of DLSS, because it's not a powerful chip and DLSS is not a free lunch. There is a computational time attached to upscaling. The question is the extent to which the capabilities of the Switch 2 may make the upscaling calculations take longer. I know there's a lot of people out there that are really hoping that Switch 2 can run DLSS at 4K. But based on projections I made based on the PC version of the technology, the old PC version, not the new one, it was like taking 18 milliseconds to generate a 4K upscale. and you've got 16 milliseconds of frame time at 60 frames per second. So the utility of it for 4K is actually quite low. But as you go down to like 1080p, 60 frames per second is kind of doable there. 1440p, possibly for 30 FPS games. So it's definitely going to be in there. The question is, first of all, is it the same DLSS that PC users have, or is it like a lightweight model that's potentially a better fit for a mobile console? Is it something that Nintendo has customized? I mean, it's perfectly viable for Nintendo to produce their own sort of lighter offshoot of DLSS because, No Man's Sky on the Switch 1 is actually using AMD FSR2 upscaling, but Hello Games actually customized it to be a better fit for the Switch hardware. So it's kind of like exactly the same principle, a lightweight version of the upscaler, which possibly doesn't have the same level of quality, but is a great fit for a handheld. So yes, it's going to use DLSS. Is it going to use PC quality DLSS? Possibly. Is there a lighter weight model that's a better fit for the handheld? Equally possible. And in fact, there was a direct reference to a lighter weight model in an upscaling patent that Nintendo actually put out at the end of last year. So yeah, I mean, that's really exciting. Ray tracing. I mean, the Ampere architecture in Switch 2, ray tracing is definitely one of the features. The question is whether the performance is there to meaningfully use it. So yeah, I mean, that's the great thing about Switch 2. It's actually a really forward-looking design, even though it's actually based on like 2-generation-old NVIDIA architecture.
That's what Nintendo does. They find the old stuff and make it work for everybody. But,
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, outside of just like the Switch 2, which I'm very excited about, what sort of impact do you think that the 50 series and the DLSS 4 will have on the handheld market as a whole? We're seeing, the Lenovo Legion Go S is up for pre-order right now. So these handheld PCs are just getting much, much better, much faster. And is this going to be a sort of a generational leap, or is this just sort of a step in the right direction?
Well, AMD kind of owns the handheld market, to be honest. There is an Intel MSI Claw coming. However, obviously AMD has its own upscaling solutions, and they've got their own machine learning based one, FSR4, coming really soon. AMD have said that it's basically only going to be running on their latest generation of graphics hardware, which is like the RX 9070 XT. So DLSS won't have any impact on AMD handhelds, but AMD has their own upscaling solution. Possibly the next generation will be compatible with FSR4. I know that AMD have actually been on the record as saying we really need to have great machine learning based upscaling for handhelds. So basically it's sort of solidifying that where NVIDIA goes, the competition follows, especially when it comes to AI features. What is interesting, though, is that NVIDIA are hinting heavily that they're going to be producing their own Windows-compatible chips for mobile. It won't be using x86 CPU cores, it'll be using ARM. Now, that combination of an ARM core and NVIDIA graphics hardware could be really interesting, and that could actually end up in a handheld. So that's something to look forward to, I think.
Yeah. Would there be any benefits for a laptop version of this GPU outside of graphics? Is it going to be a big hit to battery life, or is it just going to do what it's
the chip I'm mentioning is actually primarily designed for the laptop market. I mean, Qualcomm basically, there's a Qualcomm ARM chip that runs Windows, and you can run x86 based games on it under emulation. Now, the question is what NVIDIA are going to do with that. I mean, the Qualcomm solution, the graphics drivers are really poor, and I couldn't really get a decent gaming experience out of it at all. But there's also the question of how efficient the ARM emulator is to running x86 code. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the NVIDIA chip, because ultimately you're going to be seeing what the problem is. Is the ARM CPU emulation of x86 up to it or not? because the driver situation, well, NVIDIA know what they're doing on drivers, so that won't be a problem. I'd say there's plenty to get excited about there, and it's an area where NVIDIA haven't been able to compete before simply because they don't have an x86 license. So they're going to be rolling out these chips at some point, hopefully this year. I'm really looking forward to seeing it and seeing what they come up with, because efficiency is kind of NVIDIA's specialty. They're really good at it. So, potentially for battery life on laptops, viability of really good graphics and DLSS on a handheld, it's all there, but it's all sort of reliant on how good the x86 emulation is for an ARM CPU.
Yeah, that'll be very cool. And that is, a hypothetical, I guess not a hypothetical future, but something that is probably coming down the pike. I wanted to ask you one last question. These come out at the end of January. I'm assuming you're going to have your hands on it and you're going to have your review. Where are people going to be able to go and see that, watch that, read that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So review on the Digital Foundry channel, 5090, 5080 coming first, I believe. What I will say, though, is I think the great thing about the PC press online and on video is that everybody's really good at it at this point. So you get this massive wealth of excellent information and data that comes out, all coming out on embargo day. It's like, if you're a fan of graphics, if you're a fan of graphics technology, it's kind of time to gorge on all of this great stuff that's coming out. But yeah, we'll be there, definitely.
Richard, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. And for everything 50 series graphics cards, keep it right here on IGN.